Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another IDPC podcast. I'm Franco Loisio, Head of Communications at the IDPC. One of the aims of these podcasts is primarily to provide general information on the applicability of the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, and data protection itself. With this in mind, by means of this podcast, we're going to delve deeper into the GDPR and the concept of data processing. I welcome my guest, the head of legal of the IDPC, Ingrid Camilleri. Welcome, Ingrid.
Hi, Franco, and thank you for having me on your podcast.
Let's start with the GDPR, which essentially was enacted to safeguard the fundamental rights and freedoms of individuals regarding their personal data. It is often the subject of misunderstandings and viewed as a legal hurdle when in fact it is a core business value. With this context, can you give us a quick overview of the GDPR, its core objective, and to who it applies?
Yes, Franco. Prior to answering your question, I will pass a comment on your very valid statement, Franco, on the fact that the GDPR is the subject of various misconceptions and misunderstandings, because unfortunately it is indeed the case. The GDPR is more often than not, or very often, used as an excuse not to provide information, when in actual fact there would be no GDPR issue and data would be able to be provided. But let's go to your questions. And let's start with a brief overview of the GDPR. It was adopted in 2016, but then it was brought fully into force after a 2-year transition period on the 25th of May 2018. One can safely say that it is one of the toughest privacy laws in the world, primarily due to the hefty fines it carries in cases of established non-compliance with its provisions. As its core objective, one can say that it is the granting of more control to data subjects on how their personal data is processed, and this by means of one standardized EU law which applies in all European countries, in all EU countries. And as its applicability, let's refer to the territorial jurisdiction of the GDPR. The GDPR specifically states that it refers to a controller or a processor with an establishment in the EU, which, as part of its activities, processes personal data, irrespective of where that personal data is processed. As an example, we can refer to an American company with various offices around the world. It processes personal data and has one office within the EU. The personal data is not processed within that office, but the fact that it has one establishment in the EU makes the GDPR applicable. It also applies when there is no controller or processor, there is no establishment within the EU, but then it processes the personal data of individuals within the EU, such as by offering them goods or services, or by monitoring their online behavior. Thus, this applicability goes to show that the GDPR does not only apply to when, for instance, I have a physical file, but also when I am merely tracking a data subject, or else analyzing the online behavior of a person on a website, for instance. It is all encompassing.
This last point brings me to my next comment and question. For any business operating in today's world, data is an asset when focusing on the strategy behind that business. However, one has to tread carefully, as the data can also be the biggest liability due to security risks and compliance issues. When referring to data, what kind of information does it apply to? Is it any data?
Well, the law gives a definition, Franco, to personal data in order to avoid any ambiguities, and it defines personal data as any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. let's start dissecting this information. A natural person. Therefore, the GDPR applies solely to natural persons. It does not refer to a company. It does not refer to a company registration number, for instance, only natural persons. The definition states any information relating to a natural person, so it could be any information which is both objective and subjective. Thus, it applies to evaluations and opinions relating to a particular person. It is also, when we say any information, it also means not just a physical record, that is a physical file, but also a photo, an audio recording, and even a video recording. The definition of personal data also mentions identified or identifiable natural person, so any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. What is an identifiable natural person? It is a person who can be directly or indirectly identified by means of identifiers. The law provides a non-exhaustive list of identifiers, such as the name, the surname, the ID number, the email address, an online IP address, for instance, as once these identifiers can single out a person, then they are considered as personal data. The law goes a step further, as it also mentions factors or traits which can also be considered as identifiers, such as, for instance, physical factors, the height, hair color, eye color, cultural factors, social factors, such as, for instance, a number plate, a car registration number, which goes to show the social status of a person. Once these identifiers, individually or together with other identifiers, can directly or indirectly identify a person, then they are to be considered also as personal data.
Interesting. One last point on this, Ingrid. What about data of deceased persons? Does the GDPR apply to them? They certainly can fall into the category of identified or identifiable persons, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, they can fall in that category, but they are not to be considered as data subjects for the purposes of the GDPR. So no, the GDPR does not apply to deceased persons. The GDPR is specific in recital 27 that it applies specifically to the data of living persons. Deceased persons do not come into the picture.
So that is clarified?
Yes.
Following this foundation on personal data, let's focus on what happens when that data is actually put to use, which is known as processing. You already referred to this. I understand that this is a broad concept. It is just sharing of data, or does it go beyond? Mm-hmm. Could you explain what is exactly meant by processing of data?
Yes, it is indeed a broad concept. And it takes me, Franco, to the material scope of the GDPR before we mention the territorial scope. Now, this question, maybe as an introduction to it, can take me to the material scope, where it is stated that the GDPR applies to the processing of personal data by automated means, whether wholly or partially by automated means, and also to processing by other means than automated means, as long as that personal data forms part of a filing system or is intended to form part of a filing system. And therefore, processing refers to the handling of data, both in an electronic manner and even in a manual manner, as long there is, in the latter scenario, a structured filing system. The definition of processing, then, further clarifies this material scope and gives a non-exhaustive list of what could amount to processing, ranging from the collection of data, that is the gathering of data, to the deletion of data. So it includes, amongst others, collection, which we just mentioned. There is the storage of that data, such as when I have, even if I don't use it, when I have a file or a database with client records or emails in a particular inbox, in a particular file or folder in my inbox with client emails. It refers to the disclosure of that data when, for instance, I have client addresses and I disclose them to a delivery company.
I see.
It refers to the recording of data, that is, when I record my phone calls with my customers. And, as I just mentioned, it refers to the deletion, for example, the erasure of ex-employees' payroll records, for instance. So the reference to processing basically is from the beginning of the record, from the inception of the record, to its total erasure.
I see. Are there any principles which must be followed in terms of GDPR in this regard?
Yes, there are principles. Well, for processing to be valid and to be in term legitimate in terms of the GDPR, first of all, there has to be a lawful basis. And then there are principles which have to be adhered to. Now, it is quite a vast concept. So for the purposes of this question and this podcast, let's focus on the principles for processing. The law, the GDPR, enlists these principles. First and foremost, the processing has to be transparent, fair, and lawful. And therefore, it has to have a lawful basis. And the data subjects have to be fully aware of the fact that their data is going to be processed, how it is going to be processed, the purpose, the extent of the processing. Another principle is purpose limitation, which specifies that the processing of the personal data has to be specific, explicit, and legitimate, and therefore not used for a purpose other than that for which it was originally collected. The purpose of the processing has to be determined at the time of collection. It cannot be determined at a later stage. Another principle is data minimization, which means that the data has to be adequate, relevant, and limited to what is strictly necessary, to what is strictly required as a minimum. And therefore, if for a processing to be successful, all I need is the email address of a particular data subject, then I shouldn't request his name, his surname, and the date of birth.
It has to be limited.
Exactly, it has to be limited. Another principle is accuracy, which means that the data controller has to take it in his stride to make sure that any inaccurate data is rectified or deleted. Another principle is the storage limitation, which means that the data cannot be retained for longer than necessary, but it has to be retained for as long as is strictly necessary. That's all. Another principle is confidentiality, which means that the controller must have security and confidentiality measures in place to ensure that there is no unauthorized access to data, there is no unauthorized breach of the data. And finally, the sole responsibility for the adherence to these principles is on the data controller. It is up to the data controller to make sure that all these principles are abided to, and he or she is the one who is totally accountable. Everything basically is on the data controller.
That's interesting. Having laid the groundwork for processing, and that it essentially covers everything from simple collection to complex usage of data. As a final question, is the GDPR a blanket piece of legislation for all data activities, which covers all forms of processing, or are there any limitations in scope or exemptions? Specifically, Are there any scenarios where the law doesn't apply?
Yes, Franco, there are these scenarios. As we went through all the questions so far, we mentioned some of these scenarios. For instance, we mentioned the territorial jurisdiction, and therefore in the instances where the GDPR, and by inference where it does not apply. We mentioned the fact that it does not apply to legal persons. We mentioned the fact that in the case of manual processing, it doesn't apply if there is no structured filing system. We mentioned the fact that it does not apply to deceased persons. But the GDPR goes beyond. For instance, it does not apply to scenarios which are strictly personal and private, such as, for instance, something which has to do with family issues, or the keeping of a personal address book, for instance, or the keeping of emails between family members, the sending and receiving of such emails, their email addresses, etc. These fall into that category which the GDPR defines as the household exemption. This exemption makes it clear that anything which has to do with strictly private personal matters, the GDPR does not come into the picture. And the GDPR also doesn't feature in issues relating to processing of personal data by competent authorities for the prevention, investigation, and prosecution of criminal offences. The processing of personal data is seen to by a parallel law to the GDPR, known as the Law Enforcement Directive, which specifically apply to these competent authorities for the investigation of crimes.
Okay, that's really interesting. That's it for today's episode, and I thank you, Ingrid, for your valid contribution and intervention, and for joining me in today's episode of the IDPC Podcast. Thank you to everyone who is tuning in to these podcasts, and see you next time.